Hello everyone, welcome to Decentralized Clinical Trial Digital Week, brought to you by the organisers of Global Clinical Trials event and content series. My name is Lena Shaw and I'll be your host for today's session on achieving health equity through decentralized clinical trials. First, I'll cover some quick housekeeping items. If you experience difficulties with the audio or advancing slides, refresh your screen with the F5 button. If you're experiencing other issues, hit the question mark button to receive assistance. At any time during the presentation, you could submit your questions into the Q&A window on the left-hand side of your screen. In 24 hours, you'll receive a link to watch the recording of this session. You can also download a few featured articles in the resource list box at the right-hand side of your screen. Let's now begin by introducing our speakers for the sessions. We have Cherie Butts, Medical Director and Head of Clinical Assessments for Digital and Quantitative Medicine at Biogen, Derk Arts, Founder and CEO at Castor, and Sam Els, Co-Founder and Chief Design Officer at Lightship. Thank you for joining us today, Cherie, Derk and Sam. Now I'll hand you over to begin.
Yeah, thank you so much for that introduction. And let me just go straight to the speaker overview slide. A big thanks to Cherie and Sam for joining me and bringing their credible expertise to today's webinar. So today we're going to be speaking about achieving health equity through decentralized clinical trials. For people who know me, they know that I care deeply about this topic. It's something I post about frequently on LinkedIn, for example, and I think a problem, the lack of health equity, that needs to be addressed urgently by everyone in the life sciences space. And so today we're going to be talking about at least one opportunity we have to increase health equity through decentralized trials. Of course, decentralized trials have taken a huge flight in the past year, fueled by the pandemic, of course. And as we know, that also presents opportunities. So today we're going to be talking about an opportunity that has arisen from these developments. And Cherie, I want to hand it to you first, because perhaps you can speak to us about the problem at hand and how it pertains to life sciences.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm honored to be here and glad to talk about this topic. Clinical trials are part of the lifeblood of drug development. And so something that's important is to make sure that the trials are reflective of the population. But I want to speak a little bit more about that because sometimes people get a little bit confused and they speak of reflective of the general population. And I want to be very specific about this because of that confusion. When we say reflective of the population, we actually need to make sure it's reflective of the target population, which means those who have the disease. In any case, whether or not it's the general population or it's the target population of those who have the disease, we consistently have underrepresentation of certain groups. And in the US, this is something that's been talked about extensively, and especially with the recent clinical trials for COVID vaccines. And so what we need to do is make sure that we understand the epidemiology of a disease and then make sure that our trials are reflective of those who have the disease.
Thanks. That's a great point, because I think indeed it's tempting to look at it at a very high level and try to sort of treat every clinical trial in the same way. But in practice, of course, that's not how disease works. We just know that some diseases affect different populations in a very different way. Sam, is there anything you'd like to add to this? Of course, you have a background as an epidemiologist as well, so perhaps you've come across this problem previously.
Yeah, I would really support what Cherie says in thinking about, the distribution across trials when we're talking about very specific conditions. It's not always reflective of the general population. So one thing when we think about sort of health inequity, we really need to keep in mind that, different populations and different conditions, we need to really have trials and research that takes all of that into consideration. And I'm excited to talk a little bit more about that today. how decentralization of trials can help support that.
Exactly. And Cherie, we have this quote here that the FDA recently released guidance to support more inclusive enrollment and trial design. So it's clear that the regulators are also recognizing this problem. Can you speak to the magnitude of this issue? Is this something that is an issue in every single clinical trial, or is there specific areas where it's more glaring?
I wish that it was only certain areas, but I will tell you, I was at the FDA and we would talk about this extensively, the fact that you would have these trials, they would be enrolled, they would finish them out, and then you would look at who actually participated in the study, and you'd say, this doesn't look anything like those who have the disease. And so I'm glad that we're putting more attention to this. And I will say that I've noticed that the regulators, since my own departure from FDA, the regulators have been more insistent on this. And I believe when we had the COVID vaccines, they definitely were more declarative about it. But the problem, to your point and to your question about whether or not it's only certain diseases where we haven't had a reflection of those who have the disease, I wish that was the problem. It has been consistent. Some diseases are more glaring than others, that you get individuals. I start to say, you can see that they're picking people from the same neighborhood who, versus getting people from other neighborhoods. It's actually down to that. You can almost figure out where the trial sites are based on the reflection of who's participating in the study. And part of the problem is, by not having individuals who are reflective of everyone who has the disease, as you can imagine, you are depending on these clinical trials to make conclusions on whether or not this therapy is effective, how it modifies the disease, what its outcome is going to be. And so if you do not have those who represent broadly the individuals who have the disease, you're making broad conclusions based off a narrow population. So this is, in fact, a very important point.
Thank you so much for going a little deeper on that. And let me go to the next slide, because Sam, with your background, you may be able to speak a bit more broadly on how this turns into a problem when we start with lack of diversity in clinical trials, what that actually means for ultimately at the top of this pyramid that we're looking at for clinical practice guidelines. So maybe you can take us through the evidence-based medicine journey briefly, looking at this illustration, and then on the next two slides, talk us through how that actually impacts the evidence that's being generated, the evidence that's actually being used in day-to-day practice by physicians.
Yep, absolutely. And so when we talk about how healthcare providers work with patients to make decisions about their treatment, there's really a couple of considerations. Clinicians are trained to use evidence-based medicine, which is really using the best available research evidence. And this pyramid is the hierarchy of evidence that clinicians use to think about patient treatment plans. And it really starts at, the very foundational basis of this, where we do animal laboratory studies of how medications may work, and then work our way up through sort of case reports and case series, expert opinion based on, what's going on in the world, all the way through more observational studies. And then when we get to very, systematically tested and controlled RCTs, which is the focus of sort of, I think, where we'll land today. But all of that leads up to when we think about all the different pathways to doing clinical trials, that really rolls up into how do we think about treating patients in the real world. So a lot of meta-analyses are done where they look broadly across all of the research that's been done in the past to try and develop what leads into practice guidelines. And that's really in the real world, when we're treating patients with medications and trying to figure out what's going to work for the best outcome for them. We use clinical practice guidelines, clinical expertise, and then really considering patient preference. So when we think about the challenges of having, done research with patients that are non-inclusive or may not represent everyone who has the condition, we really run into this challenge of, these studies leading to us not being able to make really good decisions or be really informed about how a medication may impact someone or may impact broader populations as we're treating them. So this is why overall, when we think about foundationally and how we're building clinical trials and engaging with patients very early on in drug development, it's very, very important to be as inclusive as possible so that ultimately when we're, putting medications on the market and asking patients to take them, with the best intention of them having a good outcome and getting better, that we're really doing that in a way from the beginning that can be more inclusive and a better outcome for patients overall, and really help with some of these health inequities that we think about, which we know is a complex problem. But I think, planning very early on for trials is something that could really be helpful in having real representation of the broader population who have these conditions. I think, Cherie, it would be good to kind of hear your thoughts on that, because we know there are some challenges in building trust in the system, whether it's, broader, big healthcare systems, drug development, and trials overall.
So happy to comment on that. This is a really important point, Sam. And I hear many people talk about, oh, well, there's mistrust because of historical studies like Tuskegee and some of the other very well-known studies of exploring natural history on certain populations. But let's think about this. Let's take the pandemic. What do we see in the news all the time? That the virus and infections are disproportionately affecting certain communities, right? And we heard over and over again how these individuals have less than optimal experiences with the healthcare system overall. So while you may say, oh, it's because of Tuskegee that there's no trust, well, actually, yesterday I had a bad experience, right? Like, that's what you all need to understand is it's not historical. It's recent. And so if I have a less than optimal experience with my healthcare system, whether or not it's my provider not answering my questions, not understanding my questions, dismissing me, I'm getting misdiagnosed. I tell you that I've got these symptoms and you say, oh, it's probably diabetes or cardiovascular disease because that's what your community usually has, and it's something else. And so there's a disconnect. And with that disconnect, then you're going to ask someone, would you be in a clinical trial? And I find it very difficult, right? So the problem is you want me to participate in a trial. So number one, let's be clear about clinical trials. The vast majority of individuals know nothing about clinical trials. So when you ask someone to participate in a trial, they're thinking about whatever they've seen in the movies, in the news, which is usually some extreme version of it. And so they're going to immediately say no. But it's not that they're saying no, again, because of Tuskegee and something very historical. They're saying no based on their current experience, based on, okay, if I'm having problems now and I'm going to feel like a guinea pig because that's what the movies told me, then I'm really not going to do this. So one of the problems that we have is we need to explain to people the clinical trial process. We need to help them understand, what does a trial entail? But I will tell you, invariably, one of the biggest problems that I've seen about clinical trials is the fact that it is quite burdensome, right? Like, you need to go into the clinic several times. And if I'm someone who's not had a good experience going into the clinic and you're asking me to come in more than usual, then what is the likelihoods that I'm going to say yes? And so that's part of the situation that we have to take into account is, there's a little bit of a, it's not even really trust. It's more like, an allergic reaction. I haven't had a good experience. You're asking me to participate in a trial, which means I'm going to need to come in more. And that's where the decentralized trials can actually be to our advantage. Because if you are accommodating individuals' lifestyles, if you are allowing them to participate in something at their own pace, providing their opinions, e-consent, all of this other stuff, then it immediately shows, okay, now you care about me. You're listening to me. You're paying attention to my situation. And so that's a very important element in terms of building trust. By accommodating people's lifestyles, they feel appreciated. And it's going to increase the chances of them saying, okay, I'm listening. I'm open to this idea. Walk me through what's going to happen.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. Just really making participants or patients more part of the process as well, and showing that we're a lot more understanding of their needs than just pushing a protocol on them that's being created somewhere in an office very, very far away. I think that's a great point. And I think something we put on the slide here, Cherie, that you mentioned, I think was very beautiful. Could you maybe elaborate on this? What should our North Star be? And can you explain this statement?
Yeah, so I find that many organizations are talking about diversity in clinical trials being the end game. And it's not. Diversity in clinical trials is actually only the beginning. What's most important is that we include the right individuals in our clinical trials. And by doing so, that allows us to have a more comprehensive view of those individuals who have the disease. And then by doing so, guess what? Any patient who comes into their provider's office and says, okay, there's this therapy, I'm considering it. What do people with my profile, how do they respond to this therapy? So that really is the North Star, making sure that any patient, no matter what their profile, their patient journey, their background, there's an answer for any of them. People who have your profile tend to respond this way. That's the North Star.
And this is a question we didn't prepare, so I hope I'm not making this very difficult for you. But do you think that a traditional approach we have for evidence-based medicine is that actually compatible with this North Star? Can we actually achieve this through the current process of journal-based publishing and all the bias that's happening there as well? Or do we need to be looking for an entirely different system in the long run, in your opinion? Maybe Sarah, you can also comment on that.
So if it's okay, Sam, I'll go first.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so this is a really great question. And so it speaks to two aspects. One that I mentioned earlier, which is the burden, right? If I don't have the time or the lifestyle to come into the clinic every week or every other week or even once a month, then it's highly unlikely that you're going to get my attention in terms of participating in a trial. So the burden has to be addressed, which is why DCT is a very good secret weapon, as I call it. The other part is by requiring people to come into a site at a point in time, you're only capturing that information at that moment. You don't really know if that represents the average of their week. So you are depending so much on this one snapshot of data, and you're trying to generalize what does that mean overall. But when you have the opportunity to take more data points over time, it allows you to see the ebbs and flows of people's day and how they're responding and how they're doing, rather than depending on the moment they come into the clinic. And, frankly, it's like being with your principal. You're on your best behavior. You're not necessarily acting the way you normally do any other day. And so you might be getting, no fault of their own, you might be getting a false sense of how people are doing because they want to be the best student. Go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, I would agree. I think, trials are going to change over time, and we want that. There's the element of, being able to have a better understanding of people's day-to-day life and how treatment is affecting them. I also think when we think about trials of the future, while we need data that's more representative of patients and patient care, but thinking about some of these virtual or synthetic cohorts, particularly as it relates to placebo-controlled trials, that's also an element of something when you think about a patient who's seeking treatment by participating in research. The idea that you may end up on placebo, it can also be scary and a deterrent to taking part. So I think there's a lot of things that, as the world evolves and as we have more technology and more data, we can really use that to help think about these individual patient profiles while making trial participation a little bit easier for them.
Exactly, and I think that really rolls up into sort of the long-term vision I have for evidence-based medicine, which is very different from what it's like today. I think the dependence on journal publishing to bring information to physicians that are basically at the top of that pyramid is very strange to me. As we have all this very precious raw data, and like Cherie and Sam, you indicated, we'll have more and more of it, and it's going to be more reflective of the patient's real life. I think more and more it will become important that we start to make evidence-based medicine a lot more data-driven. And it's going to be so much easier to also be inclusive in evidence-based medicine guidelines if we can incorporate data from thousands of trials from all across the globe, potentially in near real time. And so really that's what I'm hoping for, that we're laying the foundation for today. We start to generate more data that's more reflective of the right population, of actual patient lives, but also moving forward deeper into how does that turn into daily practice, really making sure that the raw data can start to feed into prediction models that make predictions about individual patients and then take into account data from trials that actually included them. So I think there's a lot to look forward to. And I think we can already see some of the progress that we're making in the world. This is really not changing evidence-based medicine yet, but at least what we're seeing is that the big vaccine manufacturers with their first trials made sure they put a lot of effort into increasing diversity and more accurately matching the overall population. And I think it's funny that in this case, Cherie, this might actually be the right approach. This might be the exception to the rule, where the rule is make sure you really match the actual patient population. I think for a vaccine, you could argue that it should just be reflective of the general population. That's a whole topic I think we shouldn't get into. But I think what's great is to recognize that efforts are being put into fixing this problem, at least in some of these very important trials. And to go even further on the innovation side, we actually saw recently that IQVIA has been supporting Johnson & Johnson with more of a virtual trial approach for their phase 3 COVID-19 vaccine trials. And so we already see in the industry the recognition that decentralized trials can potentially help improve trials in general and also the diversity problem. And I thought that was a pretty nice bridge to speaking more about decentralized trials, because of course that's the topic of this entire week we're in. And so, Sam, would you maybe do us the honors of very quickly introducing this topic, because I think everyone here listening will know what this means. But I just want to spend 1 minute on the topic itself and giving you sort of the foundation to go deeper into how we can then look at how DCT can impact diversity.
Sure. So when we ask the question of, what is a decentralized clinical trial, it's really thinking about, in the context of the study, how can we increase patient convenience and decrease burden by supporting visits at home, whether that's, a healthcare provider visiting the patient at home, using telemedicine, seeing local healthcare providers to do sort of routine care, which that data can then be included in the study, as well as thinking about, in contexts where it's appropriate, having the study medication either shipped to the patient or a nurse bringing it and administering it to them in the home. and really thinking about all of this being enabled through technology. So using electronic consent, electronic source data collection that really supports the technology enablement of all of that. And that said, I think it's good to think about decentralized trials as a continuum. So there are some studies where it can be done fully virtual, where the patient never has to go into clinic, and they can take part completely from home. Where, as we know, there are some studies and some procedures in the context of those studies where they do have to be done in a clinic. We can't do invasive procedures in the home or an MRI just yet. So there's approaches where you can, in the context of patient preference, do some of those visits at home and some of those visits in the clinic, which I think people tend to think of as the hybrid approach or a partially decentralized approach to this study.
And so maybe to bring it to the individual patient, or maybe Cherie, if you want to comment on anything, then please go ahead. But we can speak briefly about how we can engage patients and raise more awareness about clinical trial opportunities.
Right.
Yeah.
So as I was mentioning, go ahead, Sam.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say this point about the vast majority not even knowing what a clinical trial is or entails is a very important one. And so in many ways, we almost need to take a step back and think about engaging people before we ask them to participate in a study, right? And so if we can use, as you've listed so beautifully on this slide, if we can use the different avenues of communicating with people to even introduce the concept of a clinical trial, why it's important, why we need to have people who are reflective in the trials, then by the time someone, a provider, a clinical trial coordinator, is in fact asking someone, would you consider this? They have that knowledge. That fear has been taken away because it's no longer completely unknown. Go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's really important to sort of think about the patient experience and recognizing that many people aren't even sure what a clinical trial is or what it's going to entail. So really building awareness from the very beginning, and then using the variety of ways that are listed here, whether that's, community outreach all the way through social media, building an awareness campaign, but also then building a journey that's very tailored for patients and patient preference, as well as thinking about interactions with their caregivers or friends or other family members who may be along or part of that journey with them, to continue to kind of engage people as they're on that journey, and whether that's going through not only the recruitment process, but in the trial, continuing to engage. I think it's also important to think about that continuing consent of the patient and understanding of their own progress and how they're doing in the study is really important to build into any clinical trial, but particularly into decentralized trials. I think we have an even more unique opportunity because we are leveraging more communication channels than just the standard of the patient comes into the clinic. We do have the opportunity here where we can have more phone and email and video interactions with patients in between visits. And I think as we talk a little bit more, I think it's one of those things that's very important to plan per study what that journey is going to look like.
And Sam, if you don't mind, I wanted to double click on something that you said. One thing that when we've been sort of digging into this idea of including more individuals from different ethnic groups, is whether or not the technology, everyone has access to the right technology to be part of it. And what was most interesting is that, several studies have been talking about this, and some individuals that I've spoken to, but I want to go with the literature so that I have something that I can give to people. But several studies have been talking about the fact that individuals from the Hispanic community are actually far more savvy when it comes to technologies. And so we should not assume that there is a lack of access. In fact, we have an advantage here of a group of individuals who have not historically participated in large swaths in clinical trials, but in fact, who are digitally savvy, and therefore they're ready, they're prepared. And so I think that's something that we have to understand and respect and not make assumptions. But in fact, there are these underrepresented communities who are better positioned through the use of technologies to participate in studies.
And so if you think about the initial impact, is that going to be sort of higher in the funnel and actually making sure there's more awareness and sort of education around trust of clinical trials? Or do we think that most of the impact can be made in enabling participation in trials through technology? Is that something you can comment on, or is there any way we can even answer that question? Sam, Cherie?
You want to go first, Sam? He said your name first.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think it's very important to do both. We do need to raise awareness, I think, more generally around clinical trials and understanding why we do them and how important they are, and that's how we build trust at the very first point of it. As well as I think it is important to continue to think about what it looks like in the context of patient recruitment, which gets very specific to the study. It also gets very specific to patient preference and how people want to be engaged and how people want to participate, that I think is also important. So I actually think it's really good for us to kind of keep our eye on both and be building for both as an industry.
I completely agree. I think that if we look at this similar to the education funnel, the more children that you introduce to, let's say, a career in science, the more likely that you'll have more children who are pursuing a career in science. And so it's the same, where if people, the vast majority, don't know about what a clinical trial is, you have to help them. You have to address their concerns. You have to address their questions. And to be quite honest, there's a whole lot of misinformation out there. And so we have to be clear about what the real truth is, provide that, answer their questions, help them, guide them through not only what is a clinical trial, but as important is what does a clinical trial entail? How much of my time is this really going to take? Because people do assume, oh, no, it's very burdensome. But if, again, as Sam said, if you're offering the use of these technologies where in the comfort of their own home, they can do e-consent, or they can do some of the other assessments, or even sign the paperwork from the comfort of their couch, then that's accommodating lifestyle, right? And so if you help them through the awareness of what a trial is, the awareness of the logistics, then once you, as just as Sam said, so once we get them to be aware, that's going to also help with the willingness, and then we're going to address the logistical aspects and any questions they may have in terms of true participation.
Yeah, that's great. And maybe, Sam, you can double-click a little bit on really how, in practice, DCTs can lead to more inclusive clinical trials. Maybe you can speak to some of your experience at Lightship, or before that at Science 37. You're a true veteran with this type of technology and approach. So would love to just hear some of your experiences in how this actually plays out in quote-unquote daily practice.
Yeah. So I think to the comment that I made earlier about there being a continuum of approaches. So when we think about a fully virtual trial, you are able to maximize a lot of the benefits around having a really broad geographic reach where people can truly take part from anywhere, making trials much more accessible. So that, studies that I've worked on in the past where you can get to that fully virtual element, which we know there are challenges and that doesn't work for every study. And even when you think about, how do we think about trials where research nurses need to go to the home and patients who may live in more rural locations, there are a lot of considerations in figuring out logistically how you make that happen. But one of the things I've seen when you're all the way in that sort of end of the continuum is that you do get to a place where from the diversity perspective, you have the opportunity and you have to build the patient experience and the patient journey. And as we talked about, all the outreach in a way that is very understandable and consumable for patients, you do have this really great opportunity to have a trial that's more reflective of the patient population with the condition, and also more broadly what it looks like across the U.S. I think the other thing we have to consider is, when we think about trials where we do need a patient still to come in to clinic, but we're thinking about those in-between visits where patients can take part from home. That's at least giving us a kind of a leg up in considering what it looks like for more traditional trials where, for a 30-minute visit, a patient may have to come in, but it took them 3 hours to get there. They have to figure out parking. They may have to pay for parking, which may or may not be reimbursed. So when we think about those types of things, in patients being able to take part from home, at least for some of the visits, I think that helps a lot in thinking about, people's willingness to participate, because you are making it more convenient for them where you can. And also that, can help with retention overall in the study, because people, as we're asking them to come in for more and more visits, that does get burdensome. And we do know that retention is a challenge in studies just as much as recruitment is as well. So anything we can do to think about those types of considerations where we're, thinking about travel and patient convenience and reducing burden is I think, very helpful for some of these more hybrid approaches.
Yeah, so I fully agree.
Do you mind if I triple click on two things that Sam said? So number one, she brought out a point that I forgot, and I want to talk about it a little bit. When many people talk about diversity in clinical trials, they are looking at ethnicity and race. But just as important as those are people who live in rural areas, which is a completely different lifestyle from those who live in urban areas. And so the point that you made, Sam, is so critical about just as much as including people from different races is including people who live 3 hours away, right, from a trial site. And so having that perspective of what the rural patient journey is versus the urban patient journey is, again, going to give us a more comprehensive set of data to be able to say people with your profile tend to have this kind of response to the therapy. So that's something that I think we really should be leveraging DCTs. If we can't address the diversity, we definitely should be addressing the distance problem. And so I think that is something that we should pay a lot more attention to through the gift that DCTs offer us. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's a great insight. I guess already a lot of things that the audience haven't come across before. So thank you so much for sharing that, because it is very easy to overlook and to just consider a certain ethnic group to be a very homogeneous group. But obviously that's not the case, as you just pointed out. And I think before we get closer to the Q&A, just want to touch briefly on, okay, great. So we're talking a lot about the opportunity here. I think we've looked at 5 or 6 different angles of how DCT can positively impact the diversity in clinical trials and therefore evidence-based medicine. But what do we need to think about on a more practical level? Because ultimately, there's quite a few operational and logistical considerations that go into planning a trial like this. So, Sam, can you touch on this briefly, sort of real-world implications? I think looking at the audience questions, there's quite a few questions also around disease areas, et cetera, that this applies to, which I think is tied to some of these logistical matters. So perhaps you can speak about this briefly.
Yeah. So when you're thinking about incorporating decentralized approaches into the study, I think it is important to start thinking about that early in the planning process. We know that, in the context of any clinical trial, it is on its own journey in terms of being approved internally, getting assigned a budget. being approved by regulators. And I think the earlier you start to incorporate these into the protocol, the better and easier that journey becomes. Another element that is really important, when you're switching a protocol that may have been more traditionally done completely in the clinic, and thinking about, what does it mean to go into a patient's home? What does it mean for a nurse to visit them? What does it mean to build materials and educational programs with patients around how to use the technology that we're implementing, or what is it going to be like to have someone visit them? Really building that patient experience is very important, so we don't have operational snags once the study is up and running. And we know that, to Cherie's early point when she opened, when you don't have a good experience as a patient, it makes it harder to build that trust. So really thinking through all the things that can happen in the context of a study, and really having an approach built around, patient visits and patient interactions and what those are going to look like is really important. And I think the other component of this that tends to be very important is really including everyone's perspective as you're building the protocol. So there are a lot of stakeholders, right? We need to think very carefully about patient experience and how we can reduce burden and make the participation early, very easy for them. But also, we need regulators to sign off on this protocol as we put it through. So incorporating the sort of array of stakeholder concerns and building that into the protocol and the operational plan, I think, is very important when you think about when you're implementing DCTs. I think some of the questions around which therapy areas, I think it tends to really depend, I think, less on therapy area and more about the protocol procedures. So when we think about, acute care or studies with, surgical procedures, those may be more challenging to implement, decentralized approaches, whereas studies that run for longer or maybe, more outpatient focused, those tend to be better fits. And certainly when we think about the spectrum of a fully decentralized trial to more hybrid approaches, I think, across the industry, there's a lot of interest in oncology, where more traditionally that hasn't been thought of as a therapy area where you can do them virtually. But when you think about some of those in-between visits and being able to build a connection where the investigator and the physician and the patient can have interactions, in between visits that are more structured in clinic, using telemedicine in a study could be a nice way to build that connection and keep it going while the trial's ongoing.
Yeah. So, Sam, to the point that you raised, that first bullet, that's an important one because, in drug development, the way that we plan is, you plan with the end in mind. Like, what do you want your label to look like? Okay, then you know what experiments you need to do to get to that label. And the same is true here. If you want your trial to look a certain way, then you plan accordingly. And I hear a lot of people talking about it will take more, increased budgets and increased timelines in order to include a more reflective population in the study. But if you planned it that way, then it shouldn't, right? So if you've planned, okay, what sites am I going to go to, to the point we raised earlier about, the epidemiology, you probably have an idea of where groups of people live. Therefore, you would have a site in that area so that you know that they can go there. Or if these individuals are in very sparse parts, then you make sure that you include the DCT so that they can be reached no matter where they live. And so if you plan early enough, carefully enough, and with the end in mind, then it shouldn't blow your budget, as some people have said, because you've thought about that and you know exactly where you need to be, why you need to be there, who you need to have, who you need to engage, how you need to engage, and all of that.
Yeah, that's great. And it ties perfectly into the last two slides that we have for the audience today before we head into Q&A, which is, of course, how Castor supports these types of trials. So Castor provides a self-service scalable platform where you can run a trial using a lot of the techniques that we discussed today, specifically, of course, techniques to recruit patients more remotely. So using modern technology to create awareness and educate patients on clinical trials, but then also actually enrolling them digitally into that trial, using video in an integrated e-consent process, where they have one single user experience, which makes it very easy for patients to participate. They don't have to juggle a variety of tools. Of course, we reflected on making the whole experience very straightforward and simple for patients to lower the barrier. And then Castor also provides researchers with the technology to actually manage all the data. So we've mentioned, we expect more and more data to start flowing into these trials to be more reflective of day-to-day activities. Obviously, you then need to be ready for that, which is a critical part of what we offer to our customers. And then on the data capture side, we allow customers to capture data through native apps that you can configure yourself. You can capture data through e-source methods or traditional eCRFs. And of course, we offer integrations with basically any other platform. And what for me personally as the founder of Castor is super important is to make sure that this technology is self-service so that anyone can start using it, that it can really scale properly. Because in the end, we can't expect a paradigm shift if this is sort of the Ferrari of the clinical trials and it can only be incorporated in a very select few trials. It's, what I believe in is that we need to make sure that this can be incorporated in over 100,000 trials within the next few years so that this becomes the new norm and we really change the diversity problem and we fix the diversity problem. Because if we ultimately only use all these cool new technologies for a very small set of trials, that isn't going to actually move the needle on the diversity side. And evidence-based medicine is much broader than the phase 3 trials. And so what I want to leave the audience with and to also think about when you think about change and you think about your SOPs and you think about this webinar in a few days and how you think it could present an opportunity to fix some of these pressing issues. And also think about how you in your organization can make things go mainstream and make it scalable so that it's no longer just an innovation project, but actually a standard that you wouldn't normally deviate from, that ensures that your trials are inclusive and that you do match the actual population in terms of ethnicity, just of gender, but also geography, as Cherie pointed out. And to ultimately create a situation, as you see on the right, where throughout evidence-based medicine, these technologies are being used instead of just the big expensive trials, because ultimately they will only fix part of the problem. So I want to leave you with that. I want to thank Cherie and Sam for all their insights, and we'll head into Q&A now. So we'll have some time to answer a few audience questions. So there's some housekeeping that I'll hand over to. Just want to point out that I invite everyone to reach out to me and connect with me on LinkedIn or Twitter. Happy to engage with you after this webinar. Sure, the same can be said for Cherie and Sam. If you're interested about the technology and services that at least a Lightship or Castor can make available to you to help you with your clinical trials. And with that, I hand it over to Lina.
Thank you, Cherie, Derk and Sam, for your excellent presentation. We've received a few questions already, but we'll give the rest of you a moment to enter your questions into the Q&A box to the left-hand side of the slides. Before we begin the Q&A, I'll run through some brief announcements. Firstly, I'd like to thank our sponsors for sponsoring this digital week. Next, I'd like to mention that we have several clinical trials digital weeks, events and training courses planned for 2021, so please keep an eye out for more details. Also, be sure to check out the resources list to the right-hand side of your screen where you can download featured articles. Now back to Cherie, Derk and Sam for questions. So the first question, do you think that nowadays everyone can access telemedicine, e-consent, etc.? Is there not a selection bias linked to access to good Wi-Fi and good cell phones, or do you advise to provide devices?
Sam, you can maybe start. Cherie, I think, also has something to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think Cherie touched on this a little bit earlier around, many people, even folks who we think may not be as technologically savvy, are and do have access. One of the things that, operationally we have found there, as I've done these trials for what's getting close to a decade now, is that that does happen. There are patients who, depending on where they live or what they have access to in terms of reliable Wi-Fi or devices that support different technologies, I found that it is useful to consider having devices available that you can deploy to the folks who need it. Also, I think having, usually the study coordinator is a really good point of access to help patients as they may be using the technology and have questions. So it's having both the tech, which we need to support the trials, but also, a person for people to call and interact with and work through any questions they have. It's really important.
Yeah, so I agree. I don't think that I want to sort of deconstruct the question. I think that there is the question of whether or not people are tech savvy, which we did talk about, and we have to separate that from whether or not everyone lives in an area that has a great tower, which is a concern. And so you can have hotspots and whatnot, but I want to agree wholeheartedly with what Sam said and about the devices. And it's not simply providing people with the devices so that they have so that they're able to access the network, but it's more about the consistency. Until we are very sure and comfortable with basically people using their own devices, which could basically collect information very differently, then it's best that a trial will have everyone using the exact same device. Because again, we've talked about this, patient journeys are different and people may use a device very differently. So if you use a device differently from your neighbor and you've got a different device from your neighbor, how will you know whether or not it's how the individuals use the device or the devices itself? And so I'm a firm believer in making sure things are as consistent as possible so that when you look at the data, then you're like, okay, you don't have any confounding factors that come from, people in the north of the country are doing things this way, people in the south, people in the west, and people in the east are doing things differently. Therefore, it's kind of hard to reconcile. So I do believe that having the same devices and then getting the data accordingly is going to be very important initially. Once we work out those details and those nuances, then in the future, not necessarily distant future, but in the future, because we will be more confident and comfortable about what are differences between individuals, then we could move toward, BYO device, bring your own device.
Great. Thanks so much. Diane? Lena?
Yes, so next question. What do you think about NIS studies and diversity in clinical trials and implementing DCT elements in the trials?
Well, let me take a stab at that first before I hand it off to Cherie. I think to provide actually an amazing opportunity to use DCT elements and to become more familiar with them. I think often it's going to be easier to implement this type of technology in non-interventional studies. So I would be highly supportive of starting there and building up experience and confidence in non-interventional trials, and then trying your hand at and bringing them into the interventional trials, which typically it will be a little bit more challenging in terms of implementing innovation. Cherie, you want to reflect on this as well?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Something that we've talked about is this idea of using non-interventional trials to introduce people to clinical trials, right? So that you have this device and you have them use it and they understand, oh, okay, this is what a trial looks like. And the reason why I believe that non-interventional trials are a good place to start is that when you have an interventional trial, guess what you have to spend, I don't know, about 80% of your time talking about on that consent form? Safety. We don't know how this particular drug candidate will work in you. And so that can be so daunting for people that you're not only asking them to do something they've never done, and you're asking them to take a therapy that no one has any idea how it's going to work. Maybe not only do you have the clinical trial awareness campaign, as Sam was referencing, you also use these non-interventional trials to get people used to it, kind of like riding a bike. And then you can, once you have settled their concerns around what a trial is like, then the sort of narrowing the list of what are they worried about can be used with those interventional trials. So I completely see a non-interventional trial as a great gateway to have people introduced and then participating in interventional trials.
Fantastic. Thank you. I think we've got time for one more question, but if you wouldn't mind keeping your answers limited, we've got a couple of questions around what kind of trials this would be appropriate for. Someone's asked whether it's oncology, cardiology, infectious diseases are most conducive for decentralized trials, and someone else has asked a similar sort of question around which cases decentralized trials fit best and which are they not a good approach. Which cases are they not a good approach?
Yes, Sam, I think you can reflect on some of your experiences and answer this question, right?
Yeah, I think overall there's probably a place across all therapy areas for some decentralization, particularly when we think about just communication, what that looks like in between visits. Doesn't mean going fully virtual across all therapy areas. One of the things that I found that's most important, and I think it ties a little bit to some of these questions about regulatory engagement, is really thinking about the collection of endpoints. And so when you're talking about a development program that's got endpoints that are really well-defined and need to be collected in a particular manner, thinking about, can that be done in the home without compromising that endpoint in any way? That's one of the most key questions in thinking about incorporating, at-home visits or remote visits or different approaches into a study. And that's usually when I'm, working with people, that's that very first starting point of figuring out together around, endpoint collection and what is that going to look like. The next biggest piece is really making sure that from a patient management and patient safety perspective, we can take care of patients in a decentralized fashion during the study. And those are the two biggest, while there are lots of other questions and operational things to work out, the two biggest considerations in thinking about any protocol or therapy area.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that response. And that's all we have time for in terms of questions today. Thank you, Cherie, Derk and Sam, for a great session. We have had it's obviously a very popular topic. We've had a lot of questions. So if anyone submitted a question that wasn't addressed, the speakers will do their best to reach out to you directly. So look out for that. Hopefully you'll get some responses. The session was recorded. You'll receive notification in 24 hours when the on-demand session is available for viewing. Please take a moment to complete the feedback form so we can continue to improve our Digital Week experience. And on behalf of the Informa Connect Life Sciences team, we wish you a wonderful day. Thank you very much, everybody.